Hi, my name's Samuel Findlay, and you're listening to the ACES podcast. In today's episode, I have a conversation with researcher Dr. Peter Sherrell. After completing his PhD at the University of Wollongong, Peter travelled the world for his research, spending time in Sweden and London before coming back to Australia, where he now finds himself at the University of Melbourne. We speak about his journey and more. So, let's get to the podcast. So I'm chatting with research fellow Dr. Peter Sherrill at the University of Melbourne. How are you going, Peter?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Sam. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. How are you, more particularly because you live in Melbourne? That's been a big talking point for me with most of my guests who are from Melbourne. I usually open up asking about that because life's been very different for you guys down in Melbourne with lockdown and whatnot.
Yeah, it's been a challenging year. So we've been in some version of lockdown really since March, which means I haven't been back to the lab. So I'm really itching to get back in and actually get my hands dirty and do some experiments again. But there's a lot of work that we still do constantly down here, whether that's engagement with the public or paper writing or things like this. So we're still super busy. It's just been such a strange year working from home and a big blurring of the work home boundary.
So just before we started recording, you said you hadn't been in the labs since March. I mean, that's got to be the longest you haven't been in the labs, right? I would assume in your career.
Oh yes, oh yes. The longest since undergrad, I would say. It's been a very different experience this year. A lot of things half finished, and like I said, itching to get back and try to get them done. But the good thing is we've now got some of the PhD students back in, so they're able to generate some new data, and that's nice because it's nice to actually be making those discoveries rather than just talking about, well, not old work, but things that you already knew about.
Yeah, and you mentioned there your undergrad. So let's begin the podcast going back to your studies and maybe start with your PhD actually, which was in material science at the University of Wollongong. What did you do for your project?
Yeah, so for my PhD, I was looking at how we can make carbon nanotubes grow in really different architectures. So at the time, what everyone else was doing was trying to grow nanotubes aligned. So they were trying to stick them all as a really dense forest and use that for a whole range of different applications. But the problem is when you grow them aligned, they all stick so closely together, you can't actually get anything in the pores between them. And so we looked at, if we add sulfur into our growth, can we induce defects that make them spiral around and force this open space and this porosity? And because the other part of my project was looking at electrochemical devices, specifically proton exchange membrane fuel cells and supercapacitors, this porosity was super important so that when we put it in electrolyte, something like sodium chloride or sulfuric acid, the ions could actually get in and interact with the nanotubes as opposed to just the surface.
So you also did your undergrad at the University of Wollongong. Was a PhD something you always wanted to do, or did it just sort of turn out that you finished your undergrad and then were like, okay, I'll do a PhD?
To be honest, it was a bit of both. I didn't have a really clear understanding of academic career pathways through my undergrad, but I always had a really strong passion for science, and I knew research is what I wanted to pursue. And as I got to the end of my undergraduate degree, we were a bit of guinea pigs. So we were the first degree going through the University of Wollongong under nanotechnology itself. So the course was still getting massaged and things were still getting implemented. But we also got a lot of exposure to research through IPRI and what later became ACES as well. Um, the and this just led into having really good connections, and I found a research stream that I was passionate about and went down the PhD path and haven't looked back, basically.
So that passion for science, when did that sort of begin? Was that something that you sort of, uh, I guess, picked up maybe in high school, or was it, prior to that, or?
I honestly don't have a really good memory of when that happened. It's just sort of always been something that I've enjoyed looking at. Even in primary school, I always loved, history and archaeology and the science of dinosaurs and the science of asteroids and space, which is completely the opposite of what I do now, where I look at the tiny little things. But that sort of interest in how things work was there for a young age. And then when I started doing physics and chemistry in high school, it really solidified, my interest in that side of things, manipulating things at the tiny level to make new properties and new devices for different for different things that can help people.
So I guess, is that why nanotechnology was the sort of specific science you decided on?
Um, yeah, it was. It was a combination of a few different things, but one of the big things was honestly, I came out of high school with knowledge I wanted to do science. I wanted to do physics and I wanted to do chemistry. And nanotechnology was this brand new thing at the time. While people had been doing it for, 20, 30 years, it hadn't really been codified into a field. And the course they offered in nanotechnology really bridged all aspects of science. So I focused, like I mentioned, on chemistry and physics, but you had the opportunity to go down a biology stream if you wanted. You had an opportunity to go down a much more materials engineering stream and a chemical engineering stream. And so it was a degree that gave us a lot of flexibility while still focusing on the core aspects I was interested in from high school. But really, I had very little understanding of what I was getting myself into at the time.
And you also did a graduate certificate in research commercialization. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So we did that through UniQuest, which was a joint offering between the University of Wollongong and the University of Queensland, and that was a semi-intensive course over. It was a semi-intensive course over a weekend, and then 4 subjects over the course of a year. And that's been really interesting to give me a different perspective on my research, sort of to keep in mind, hey, can we commercialize this? Can we try to patent it? Can we drive it that way? So that was a really good experience.
And I guess speaking about that sort of commercialization, I mean, for the majority of your career, I mean, you've stayed in research. Did you always want to stay in research rather than industry, or was there maybe a point in time where you thought about going into industry?
I mean, it's never a closed door. I always try to collaborate closely with industry, but what my expertise is really in the fundamental science, the fundamental side, and then I like to collaborate into, people who do really nice device science and things like this. So for me, research has always fitted much nicer in an academic setting. And I'm also really passionate about mentoring the next generation of PhD, honours, master's students, and things like this. And so I get a little bit more opportunity to do that in a academic, I guess, university setting.
Sure. And after your PhD, you stayed on with UOW and ACES as a associate research fellow. Is that correct?
Yeah, so my PhD got delayed, I guess. It took quite a long time to come back from review. So I think it took well over 9 months, almost a year before my
Right.
comments came back. And so during that time, I was working. I was working as an associate research fellow at ACES, and I got the opportunity to also go and visit Richard Kaner over at UCLA, which was a great opportunity. And I learned a lot of the skills there that have really helped me through my postdoc. Learned how to use CVD to grow graphene, that's chemical vapor deposition to grow graphene, and how to transfer graphene and start to use 2D materials, which I've then used on later in my career at Imperial College and now at the University of Melbourne.
Yeah. So speaking about your career progressing, you then went overseas for the next part of your career. First of all, you picked up a new position in Sweden. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So I was working at Linköping University, which is a small city about halfway between Copenhagen in Denmark and Stockholm in Sweden. And it was a really lovely time, completely new experience, completely different weather to Australia, much, much colder, obviously. And what we're working on there is trying to take that graphene experience I had from my associate research fellow, as well as some of the biointerface experience I got there as well, and apply that to trying to design new natural polymer patches, what we call, so things from collagen and alginate, to develop systems where we could put electrically conductive nanomaterials in. So we're putting carbon nanotubes in, we're putting graphene into these things and using them to make patches for either myocardial infarction, so to treat someone who's had a heart attack and has scar tissue on the heart, or we were using some without the carbon nanotubes or graphene to implant into artificial corneas. So try to make replacement corneas for people who had corneal damage and things like this.
Wow. And how did that opportunity come about?
So it's a bit of a strange one, that one. So my wife also works in science and she has a PhD as well. And we were looking for jobs at the same time. And she got a really excellent opportunity in Sweden. And so we decided, no, one of us has got a great job, we'll go. And then while I was over there, I was networking and talking to different people, and someone was looking for someone with expertise in carbon nanotubes and graphene, and I fit the bill. And it was a really nice sort of just serendipitous thing that happened for me.
Sounds it. And then I believe you moved from Sweden to London.
Yeah, so we at the end of Sweden, we were ready to um, try a different adventure. One of the joys of science for us is the ability to travel and work in different environments and different places and really broaden our experience. And so we decided sort of a year before we left Sweden that we were ready to move. And so I applied for a Marie Curie Fellowship at Imperial College London and moved over there to get a little bit back more to the energy side that I was familiar with from my PhD. So we went over there to start looking at 2D materials, really for supercapacitor and sensing applications and things like this.
And how long were you in London for?
I was there for about 3 years. And yeah, it was absolutely wonderful time. Loved living in London. Um, yeah, amazing time over there.
And were you hoping to stay there long term, or obviously now you're at the University of Melbourne and back in Australia? But did you want to stay in London long term, or was it always this, maybe thinking that you would come back to Australia?
We were always originally planning to come back to Australia. When we were in London, we started umming and ahhing a bit about whether we wanted to stay. But there were a few things that happened that sort of just led us to want to come home and be closer to family again. And that really drove our decision to leave the UK and come home.
Yeah, sure. And so now you're at the University of Melbourne as a research fellow, as I mentioned. What are you currently working on?
At the moment, we're looking at still leveraging this experience in 2D materials and carbon nanotubes into making wearable patches. So things that you can put on your body that will convert the energy from you walking around into, the motion of you walking around into electrical energy. So ideally something that can power sensors or capacitors or eventually even recharge your phone, although that's a long way away in the future. So really trying to look at how different nanomaterials interact to induce some new property in a polymer material. Great.
And I often see that you're collaborating with many people, many researchers from ACES as well. I noticed that you've had a few papers out recently.
Yes, yeah, it's been a quite good year with collaborations and things like that. Surprisingly, being in Melbourne, if you want any experimental papers now, it very much has to be collaborative. So yeah, we've got some nice work out. We've got some work out with Jun Chen, who's a PI at ACES, who looks at things like thermocells and catalysis a lot. They've been really fruitful collaborations. I collaborate a little bit with Joe Rizal down at Deakin, who used to be a ACES fellow, and they're the main ones that I focus on at the moment.
Yeah, and we spoke about at the start of this podcast, not being able to go into the labs this year, not since March for you. How have you found being a researcher this year? Obviously, you're working from home and you can do a lot more writing, I guess, but how have you found that? And how do you think that has maybe helped you as a researcher?
It's been difficult, to be honest. Over the first few months, there was a lot of backlog of data sets you could interpret and a lot of new data you could get through and that you could manage, and you could produce some, still quite new results and quite interesting things. As time goes on, that starts to fade a little bit, and you're really starting to focus on writing a review article or writing a perspective or something like this, which is interpreting someone else's data. What's been good for me is it's given me time to think about how to define my research and how to what I need to do to progress it moving forward. And that's a sort of a space and time I wouldn't have got without the current situation over here, at least.
Yeah, sure. And we spoke about your career, and you've had many different experiences overseas, now back in Australia. I wonder, is there maybe one highlight that sticks out more than the rest?
Honestly, the 3 years in London were absolutely amazing. And working at Imperial, working at the Department of Materials there, and just having the opportunity to live and work in Europe for 5 years is just absolutely amazing, and something so many careers don't give you. So I've been really all of that's an absolute highlight. Yeah.
So speaking a little bit about your career, or rather your life outside of your career, what do you like to do in your spare time, your downtime, when you're not in the labs and not focusing on research?
I mean, at the moment, walk around within 5 kilometers.
Yeah, I guess it's tough to answer right now.
Tough to answer right now. Normally, I like to tend to play a bit of sport. I like to play a bit of squash. I like to play some soccer or football, and just sort of muck around that way. this year again's disrupted all of that. So, it's been a bit strange.
So something I've asked everyone that I've had on the podcast, and this might be very different than previous years for you because of the recent lockdown through COVID, but is there maybe a morning routine or something that you do every single day that helps you approach your work?
Well, of a sort. I mean, my morning routine at the moment is to wake up, take my toddler downstairs, make sure he's eating, and then ship him off to daycare. Because if we are working from home and he is home, there is no work that's done. And then it's basically just go and get a coffee, have a little bit of a relax, get 5 minutes outside to get some fresh air before you start work.
Coffee's one I often hear on this.
I think it's a pretty standard vice in academia is excessive caffeine intake.
That's how I start my day too. So, so just to finish up, I'm wondering if you could maybe offer any advice to PhD students that are currently on their journey, or just starting out in their early research career.
Yep. Yeah, if you're just starting out and you're looking at what you want to do, the two things I would give advice for is be realistic about the chances of progression in academia. It's an extremely competitive career path, really, really rewarding, but don't go in under any illusions about funding success rates and things like this. It's something you don't really understand going through your PhD. So have a think about that. And the second thing is when you're looking for a postdoc, talk to people who work in the lab and see how the mentor or the supervisor is to work with, because having somebody who's supportive can really boost your career so dramatically. And you're very time limited. You really only have 5 years post PhD to define your research platform and your research direction. And so losing a couple of those years to negative circumstances really can limit where you end up.
Great advice. Well, thanks so much for joining the podcast. It's been good to catch up, and wishing you all the best as you navigate this difficult time, especially down in Melbourne through the restrictions with COVID.
Thanks very much, Sam. It was great to have a chance to chat.
Thanks for listening to the ACES podcast. For more episodes like this one, be sure to subscribe wherever it is you get your podcasts. You can also find more information about ACES on our website, electromaterials.edu.au. There you'll find links to our various social media platforms. And you can also follow me on Twitter @SamuelFindlay. Until next time, thanks for listening.